So like I said, it's experiential education and experiential learning, and we're going to dive into the philosophy of experiential education briefly here, based on criteria for educative projects via experience. In 1933, Dewey identified in How We Think 4 criteria for projects to be educative. 1, must generate interest. 2, must be worthwhile intrinsically. 3, utilize problems that open curiosity and call upon knowledge that they may have not yet had to apply in their lives. 4, take place over an extended period of time. And in 1994, Eiler and Giles identified these 4 as necessary underpinnings for the philosophy of experiential education, and then also for the theory and the practicality of the pedagogy of service learning. And we're going to move on here to talk briefly about experiential learning theory as Kolb has defined it. You have concrete experience, then you reflect and you observe based on that experience that you had, then you go to the literature, to the research, and you can do the abstract conceptualization thing, and then you move on to active experimentation again. And essentially this is a cycle that service learning takes on as you're going through a service learning experience. So that's kind of where service learning sits in regards to that. And service learning has previously been identified as an engaging pedagogy by a countless number of authors there, but that last one is Koo, 2008, which is George Koo, who has done a lot of the research and a lot of the development of the NESI and the OSSI. And he's also identified service learning as a top 10 engaging practice for keeping students engaged in the classroom environment. So this leads me to where we are currently, which is service learning in New Zealand. Service learning in New Zealand hasn't been going on as we know service learning in the United States for very long. I've actually found 2 classes at the University of Canterbury that are using what seems to be service learning method of teaching. So I found myself in these classes. In one of the classes as a student, the 309 course, Geography 309 course, I was a student. In the Management 208 course, I helped as a staff tutor. So let's go to the research questions and see what was driving this study. What do students and teachers experience in service learning environments in New Zealand classrooms? What is the relationship with service learning and student engagement and the outcomes typically attributed to service learning? How does service learning influence student engagement in these 2 courses? And how can students and teachers' experiences perhaps inform other areas? What's transferable and relatable to other experiences from my study? So those are my research questions that are driving this study. Data collection, there's been a call for more rigorous methods, so I've heeded that call via a mixed methods design. Qualitatively, I'm using naturalistic inquiry, where I use observation and artifacts and interviews in order to help bring these students' experiences to life. Quantitatively, I'm using the OSSI, which I've unpacked briefly, and then the service experience survey, which essentially identifies how much service students have had access to previous to their time in this class, and then how they view their experiences while they're in that class. It was actually the survey that guided the 1999 work, Where's the Learning in Service Learning by Giles and Eiler. Moving on to data analysis, I use naturalistic inquiry, which calls for a purposive sample, inductive data analysis, grounded theory, and of course an emergent design, which transpires throughout the time in the field researching my participants. All right, so now we're going to move on to the initial findings, and I disclaimer, very initial findings, from 19 one-hour interviews in the initial administration of the OSSI survey. So looking at it through the quantitative lens of my mixed methods design, the OSSI actually helped me identify my purposive sample. So through some observations through the first couple of weeks of the semester and the administration and initial analysis of the OSSI, I was able to identify students via a maximum variation sample, where I got students who were lowly engaged, moderately engaged, and highly engaged. Now, the low, moderate, and high is reflective of the scores from that group that I looked at, which was 25 students from the management course and 30 students from the geography course. So in both groups, based on the OSSI, they fell into one of those 3 categories, as I just mentioned, based on their engagement and service scores. And then I'm in a position now where I'll administer a follow-up survey in late to mid-October, where if we all look at our watches, that's exactly where we are right now. And I've administered my final 2 surveys this last week and have not had time to analyze them, but I look forward to being able to do that. Now the qualitative side were based on the interviews and the observations that I've had as a student in this class. I essentially enrolled myself into the Geography 309 class, and was a student as a student is a student. Granted, I was also researching, so I divided that line between observer and participant as best as possible. So based on what it means to be a student, when I was interviewing the students who represent this opinion, they identified that being a student in 309 has career and real-world relevance. There's group work and a feeling of belonging. It's different from other classes that they've had. It's more about being self-motivated, and there's a relationship that transpires with the lecturers. There was a field trip at the beginning of the semester, which was part of being a student in that class. You work with a community organization, and you dedicate hours outside of class to the project that you're working on by, for, and with that community organization. When asked to talk a little bit about what it means to be engaged in the classroom, these areas here emerged. This idea of involvement, being involved with the people that you're working with. Contribution, which to me was represented in a qualitative piece of research, a piece of data that stated that engagement is dialogue, not a monologue. And a lot of classrooms are set up in a very monologue-like way, where you have a person like me sitting here and telling you things, and there's no dialogue going on here, so there might not be much engagement on the other end of the camera. We'll see. Expression, being able to express their ideas. Interest, which is a very interesting component because interest might even come before being engaged in something. And we'll unpack this in a model here in a second. And then beyond listening, moving into interaction with their fellow classmates. It's different from other classes based on the real world application and the career relevance, the group work that drives the class, and the sense of belonging that emerges from that. It's different because they said it's different, which I thought was really interesting. And then the amount of self-motivation and the interaction with lecturers. And then the project that they were working on, the specific project which each group was working on, they identified that project as being interesting, worthwhile intrinsically, and a place to open up new knowledge and to apply it, which, falling in line with Dewey's criteria of 4, seemed to align quite nicely. This is essentially some of the coded qualitative data that this initial diagram came from. You can see a similar color scheme.